I'm told the Deepcool CH160 is an excellent budget case, but my problem is that most reviews of it are with high-end systems, of course aren't budget. So instead of putting a 4080 and a 7800X3D in here, I'm going to put an actual budget system inside for this review, so that you can see if a budget ITX system is actually on the cards for you. For an ITX case to actually be budget, I look for a few criteria. Okay, under 60 quid including tax, tick. Actually small, tick. Supports some actually decent cooling, tick. Supports ATX power supplies, tick. Catwalk ready, oh tick. Looking good so far, right? Yeah, but to get a fair assessment, we'll have to crack the CH160 open and see how it all works. Tiny screws hold the panel in place, which at the budget range is fine. I don't really need it to be toolless when it's this price. I really like that the screws are flat rather than thumb screws. To me, this looks a lot more sleek. You just got to make sure that you keep them safe because they're easy to lose. The back panel comes off, the top panel and the handle comes off, the glass panel comes off, and the front I/O comes off. And you will need to take all these panels off in order to build it, at least in my opinion. The top has these rails that you can also take out, and this is where you can mount a 120mm fan in the top if you want. Board support is just ITX, of course. CPU cooler height is a massive 172mm, so you can get most tower coolers in here just fine. So a Thermalright Assassin cooler would be ideal for a budget baller, but you could easily just stick with your stock coolers as well. I don't really think you could fit a liquid cooler in here, except maybe if you wanted to squeeze a 120mm on the back. Power supplies can be ATX or SFX. The case is really designed best with SFX power supplies because it will allow a front fan mount and a bit more space for components and cable management inside. SFX units will have the fan facing out the back panel, but normal ATX units will fit as well, with the exception of those really big ones. You've got to move this little metal piece across so that you can actually mount the power supply, and you're going to mount it with the fan facing the front of the case where it's going to get a lot of fresh air. A modular power supply is definitely your friend here, although it's theoretically possible to do this with a fully wired one. It's going to be a bit annoying to cable manage. The difficulty with using an ATX power supply in here is that the cables hanging down can restrict your GPU choices, simply due to the cable bulk. It might be possible to max out the GPU length with an ATX unit in there, but it's definitely going to be pretty tight. There's an extension cord that goes across from your power supply and out the back, and there's a small indent in the case that allows that cable to be routed through. Graphics card support is 305mm long, and that means that a lot of higher end graphics cards won't fit in here, and you will have to check the clearances yourself according to the product page. GPU just plugs into the motherboard in a normal way, which is part of what keeps the cost down. There's no need for a fancy riser piece here. There's 3 slots of clearance with a nice mesh basement for a good supply of air. The case front I/O panel normally needs to come out in order to put your graphics card in, though with a really small card you might be able to just slink it over the top and plug it in. I think it's a bit of a shame that the case wasn't about 20mm longer, so that the bigger cards can fit in and overall makes the build process a bit more comfortable, but it is what it is. For drive support, you've obviously got motherboard M2 slots, you've always got those, and there is a multi-function plate on the front of the case. This will let you mount a 2.5-inch drive or a 3.5-inch drive, the latter only really if you can stomach how bad it looks. It will also support a 120mm fan, but only if you're using an SFX power supply like we spoke about earlier. For fans, you can put a fan on top of that rail that we talked about earlier, and on the back just using a normal slot. If you're not using a rear fan, there are cutouts on the side which look like they could probably hold a storage drive. The best airflow pattern for the CH160 is probably reversed, so rear intake then top exhaust, though there is an argument for a traditional front to back scenario if you're using an SFX power supply. The only difficulty with that will be that there's actually no mesh filtration on the rear fan slot, so if you're really worried about dust in your environment, you might want to get a magnetic one to stick over the top. Front I/O is USB-C, USB 3, power button and headset, which is fine. It looks perfectly clean and acceptable. For the cooling, any budget or mid-range system will be just fine in here, especially given the mesh basement for the GPU and the impressive tower cooler support for the CPU. All but the most powerful systems will work really nicely in the CH160, and that is the market that this is aimed at. And to show that this is a budget case, I put together this sub £500 1080p gaming PC in the CH160, and on the back of that, what are the pros and cons of this case? One of the big pros is the cost. It's just £55 to £65 here in the UK, which undercuts most other ITX cases on the market, while still being aesthetically pleasing. I like the overall look and feel of the case. It's nice and simple. It's got nice build quality. The compatibility is not stellar, but it's decent enough, and being a budget case, I think it's a reasonable compromise to miss out on those really long and expensive graphics cards, which inherently aren't going to be within a budget builder's price range anyway. And now the downsides, and there are some. It's quite a wide case in order to accommodate tower air coolers and modern GPUs, but that's less of a con and more of a design choice as far as I see it. What is really poor though is the cable management. There's no points to actually manage cables effectively anywhere in this case, so it's really hard to make it look neat. I would say my main criticism is that the case could do with being a tad longer, even if it's just a few centimeters. With this extra length, you could put higher end graphics cards in and probably set it up to have the ATX power supply facing the back panel in a similar way to the SFX. That might make the internals a bit easier to manage, as well as looking a little bit cleaner. So balancing all of what we've learned, I would say the CH160 is a good but not great case. It's certainly the best budget ITX case I've ever seen and has some thoughtful features. It's just a couple of bits of polish away from being a truly excellent chassis. So Deepcool, I really am digging the CH160, and maybe you could really nail it with a CH170 in future. Who knows?